sittings and committee meetings. You can rewind, pause, or go to a specific contribution whenever you want, from your home, office, or on the go. Log on now to ParlView at parlview.ttparliament.org.
Follow the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament.
Honorable the President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we acknowledge you as a supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
The President.
Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. October the 5th, 2017. Dear President of the Senate, Establishment of Joint Select Committees. At a meeting held on Friday, September the 29th, 2017, the House of Representatives agreed as follows. 1. Having regard to the decision of the House made pursuant to Standing Order 79-3 on Friday, September the 15th, 2017, be it resolved that the Gambling, Gaming and Betting Control Bill 2016 be referred to a Joint Select Committee for its consideration, and that this committee be mandated to adopt the work of the Joint Select Committee in the second session, 11th Parliament, and report by March 31st, 2018. 2. Having regard to the decision of the House made pursuant to Standing Order 79-3 on Friday, September the 15th, 2017, be it resolved that the Cybercrime Bill 2017 be referred to a Joint Select Committee for its consideration, and that this committee be mandated to adopt the work of the Joint Select Committee in the second session, 11th Parliament, and report by March 31st, 2018. I respectfully request that the Senate be informed of these decisions at the earliest convenience, please. Respectfully, Bridget Mary Anisette George, Speaker. Honorable Senators, as you are all aware, former Senator Clive Pantin passed away on Saturday, September the 30th, 2017, and I now invite you to offer tributes. Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, before I start, let me crave your indulgence as we open the third session of the 11th Parliament, and seeing that I was absent at its opening, I just want to, as the Leader of Government Business, to formally welcome Senator Haynes, Senator Hussain, I don't want to call his first name, and Senator Obika to the Senate, and wish them a very fruitful and productive session. Madam President, today I have the honor to rise and pay tribute on behalf of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and the People's National Movement to a great son of our soil, Mr. Clive Pantin. Mr. Pantin was born in 1933 and passed away a couple of weeks ago, making him 84 years of age at the time of his passing, meaning that he lived well beyond the biblical 70. And I'm sure it is because he was a true servant of the Bible. As you are aware, Madam President, the Pantin family has distinguished themselves as an outstanding family who have given human service to the country of Trinidad and Tobago in the field of religion, education, social work, and community development. Clive's late brother, Archbishop Anthony Pantin, was the youngest and first local archbishop of the Diocese of Port of Spain. His other brother, Father Gerald Pantin, among other things, is famous for the formation of Serval, which still remains today as the model for social intervention in challenged communities. Clive distinguished himself in the field of education, having been a teacher at Fatima College and rising to the position of being the first lay principal of that college. An educator par excellence, may I add. To most people's surprise, Madam President, in 1981, he entered the political arena and contested the Port of Spain South seat for the ONR and lost. But having said that, I am personally convinced that he was one person who entered politics with very noble intentions in seeking the betterment of his community and the wider Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular, the students of Trinidad and Tobago. However, after the NAR's victory in 1986, he was appointed as Senator and Minister of Education. He was the first principal of Fatima College to hold such a distinguished office. And just for the records, our current Minister of Education was also a former principal of Fatima College. But as an educator, Madam President, I think he served with distinction. In 1990, after the death of Mr. Devines during the coup, he contested the Diego Martin Central by-election for the NAR. Regretfully, again, he lost, but lost to a newcomer who would go on to distinguish himself in the field of politics, the now deceased Mr. Ken Valley. Again, in 1981, he contested the Diego Martin Central seat and lost again to Mr. Valley. Regretfully for him, I guess, he never experienced the joy of winning a seat. Having said that, he also played football for casuals, and actually he represented Trinidad and Tobago in football. But Madam President, of very high note in my humble opinion, after 1991 elections, he took a very distinguished exit from politics and focused his life on education and social work through the Catholic Church. He founded FEEL, which is the Foundation for the Enhancement and Enrichment of Life, and he continued this effort until his passing. As a piece of trivia, and this was provided by the Parliament, I see he authored the Spanish textbook, Vamos Amigos. It really brings back memory because, Madam President, that was my Form 1 Spanish text. He has left to mourn his children, David, Bernard, Thomas, Salma, and Anna, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grand, and many close friends and relatives, As a matter of fact, Bernard is now currently the head of communication at the NGC, which falls under the Ministry of Energy. So now on behalf of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and on behalf of the People's National Movement, I offer our deepest condolences to his close friends, family, and relatives. And in closing, Madam President, I say to you, Clive, you have served well. You have served your God well, and you have served your country well. May your soul rest in eternal peace, my brother. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to pay tribute on the passing of one of our exemplary citizens whose monumental contribution to the development and growth of our nation is synonymous with the Pantin family. In this context, it is difficult not to recall on this solemn occasion some of his iconic predecessors who have traversed this earthly plane on a one-way ticket to nirvana, and who I am sure are sitting in the hollow chambers of the grand mansion. Of course, Madam President, I'm referring to the Venerable Anthony Pantin, former Archbishop of Trinidad and Tobago, and his brother, Father Gerard Pantin. Today we celebrate both the life and the passing of yet another Pantin, the last of that trio of indomitable Pantin brothers who straddled our society like the colossal of Rhodes, the late Clive Pantin. Madam President, the late Clive Pantin was an extraordinarily talented and multifaceted individual. He was an educator par excellence, a philanthropist, a humanist, a politician and government minister, and a sportsman of no mean repute. During his tenure as a senator, he was a minister of education and a minister of health. He excelled in both areas. He also left an indelible mark as a humanist and social worker, which is most fittingly exemplified by his establishment of the Foundation for the Enhancement and Enrichment of Life, also known by the acronym FEEL, which provided a social lifeline for the upliftment and advancement of the less fortunate among us, those who unfortunately were left behind in the socio-economic development of our society. He was incomparable in the field of education. He was an exemplary teacher at Fatima College, one of the preeminent institutions of secondary education in our country. He created history by becoming the first lay person to be appointed principal of a Catholic institution belonging to the Holy Ghost Fathers. The monuments to his achievements as an educator are the numerous individuals who were the beneficiaries of his teaching and have graduated from the portals of Fatima College to be outstanding pillars of our society, making their contributions to the development of our nation. Madam President, the luminosity of his achievement are embedded not only in the areas of education and or humanism, but equally in the field of societal activism. In the Woodbrook community where he lived, he was an active member of the Woodbrook Action Committee, giving concretivity to the view that he was equally active in the work of the community. This provided a launch pad for his active involvement in politics between 1986 and 1991 as a member of the National Alliance for Reconstruction. He was a stalwart. He was a titan. He was a man among men. And unlike King Henry VIII of Tudor England, he was unquestionably a man for all seasons. He was always of the people, with the people, and for the people. Truly a man for all seasons. During his tenure as a member of Parliament, he made significant contributions to 9 parliamentary bills. His parliamentary contributions were always informative and fulsome. The debates in Parliament benefited enormously from the depth of his knowledge and the breadth of his vision. Over the eons, Madam President, many great souls, many great pillars of our great nation have been snatched away from our presence by the icy hands of the grim reaper known as death. We today mourn and celebrate, as I said, his passing and his life, rather. The situation of our late brother, Clive Pantin, is no less so. The difference, however, is that now we have the indomitable trio of Anthony Pantin, Gerard Pantin, and now Clive Pantin. Madam President, we in this august chamber can rest comfortably in the fact that we now have the Pantin triumvirate, or Trinity, with our Heavenly Father. We remain confident that they are all continuing to serve the interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago and to fully represent them in that grand mansion in the presence of the Almighty, and to ensure that we remain his divine guidance and protection. Madam President, the passing of the late, great Clive Pantin was indeed the passing of a juggernaut. May God bless his memory and keep him in perpetual peace. Condolences are extended to his entire family and friends.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. It's an honor to bring tributes to the passing of this great man on behalf of my colleagues on the independent bench. And I'll start my tribute with a quotation from Douglas MacArthur. A true leader has the confidence to stand alone, the courage to make tough decisions, and the compassion to listen to the needs of others. He does not set out to be a leader, but becomes one by the quality of his actions and the integrity of his intentions. And I couldn't think of a more fitting quotation to encapsulate the life and the service of Mr. Pantin. When we think of true leaders in Trinidad and Tobago, Clive Pantin easily stands a giant among men and women. Brother, husband, father, friend, educator, humanitarian, and patriot. Just a few descriptives that attempt to characterize this amazing human being who in his 84 years has touched so many lives, helped so many people, and all quietly with grace and dignity. Clive Pantin was born in 1933 and was involved in many sporting disciplines at St. Mary's College and was able to balance sport and academics very well. He was originally educated at Belmont Intermediate, for which he was very proud, and later at St. Mary's College in Port of Spain. Mr. Pantin graduated from the University of Ireland with a Bachelor of Arts honors in French and Spanish and returned home to teach at Fatima College. He also obtained a diploma in education at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, prior to Trinidad and Tobago becoming independent in 1962. While teaching at Fatima College in the 1960s, Mr. Pantin served as sports master, leading that institution to an inter-call victory in 1965. During the 1960s, Mr. Pantin also became involved in the West Hall Youth Cricket League. He was also rewarded for his excellent work as a teacher by being appointed to high positions that were previously held only by priests at Fatima, including that of principal. There was no doubt that during his 24 years, he was attached to the Fatima College. He made significant contributions towards that institution, becoming one of the premier secondary schools in this country and the Caribbean. As a young sportsman, he played club football at the Port of Spain Football League, when football in front of the grandstand at the Queen's Park Savannah was in its heyday. His standard of play was good enough to earn selection for many teams in the North against South classics of the day. He also represented his country from 1957 to 1962, and also represented his country in the discipline of hockey. His civic-mindedness and caring for people and community and country prompted Mr. Pantin to enter the political arena. In 1981, he resigned from teaching and entered the fray of politics. He did not win the seat he contested, and so entered the private sector in the field of personnel management. He re-entered politics 5 years later and was appointed as senator. He served as Ministers of Education and Minister of Health within the 1 5-year term. During the term of the National Alliance for Reconstruction, 1986 to 1991, he considered his service as education minister as one of the highlights of his career. I'm quoting him here now, open quote, "I would say my major role as a Minister of Education, I enjoyed it very much. When you are a principal of a school, you see minor changes, but when you see all the schools combined, it's a very tough task." He also served for a time as chairman of the National Advisory Committee on Education. After the defeat of the NAR, Mr. Pantin founded FEEL, the Foundation for the Enhancement and Enrichment of Life, in 1991. He and his team distributed hampers to about 120 NGOs from the massive warehouse owned by J.B. Fernandez at Laventille. He established FEEL to be used as an effective vehicle to assist the alleviation of poverty and hunger throughout Trinidad and Tobago. His ongoing work as CEO of this charitable organization was widely recognized as one of the helping to improve the quality of life for many underprivileged folk in Trinidad and Tobago. He's, as was previously indicated, the brother of 2 inductees at the CIC Hall of Fame, the late Archbishop Anthony Pantin and Father Jerry Pantin. I myself was privileged to meet Mr. Pantin about 15, 20 years ago and worked closely with him on a Christmas food drive called We Can. We were able to raise monetary donations, clothing, and food to help needy individuals for over a year. And the success of this project was primarily because of what Mr. Pantin's name brought. It brought to the project integrity, trust, and accountability. His name and word were respected and stood for something, quality many of today's leaders would do well to emulate. Simply put, Mr. Pantin was a giant amongst men and women. On behalf of my colleagues on the independent bench, please allow me to express our deepest condolences to his family, friends, and colleagues. May God grant his family the strength and grace through this difficult period. And thank you for sharing Mr. Pantin with a grateful nation. This country is so much better for his service. Madam President, I thank you.
Honourable Senators, permit me to join with those who have spoken in paying tribute to the late Clive Pantin. It strikes me that we are paying tribute to Clive Pantin in this chamber because it was in this chamber that he served as a senator and Minister of Health and then Education. But as we have heard, Clive Pantin's entire life was premised on a devotion to service, not just at the parliamentary level, but at almost every level of human endeavor. His was a life of service to his family, to his church, and to the many students whom he mentored and whom he called the flowers of the nation. He was a multifaceted, multi-talented, and from all that I have heard, a generous man. His unstinting focus on his fellow man is highlighted when one looks closely at the name of the organization he founded, namely the Foundation for the Enhancement and Enrichment of Life. Clive Pantin's life exemplifies excellence, and we are grateful for his service. In closing, I am reminded of the words of a famous poet. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. May his soul rest in peace. Honourable Senators, we will now observe a minute of silence. Honourable Senators, I will now instruct the Clerk of the Senate to convey to his family the sentiments that have been expressed today.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives on the supplemental order paper, the Appropriation Financial Year 2018 Bill 2017, in the name of the Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper. Sorry. Madam President, in accordance with the standing order, I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. This? That's what I did. Yeah. Madam President, I will rise and say, Honourable Senators, sorry. Right. Sorry. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Apologies, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The next stage of the bill will be taken later in the proceedings.
Papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name, in the name of the Minister of Finance. The draft estimates of expenditure for the financial year 2018, the draft estimates, details of estimates of recurrent expenditure for the financial year 2018, the draft estimates of revenue and expenditure of the statutory boards and similar bodies and of the Tobago House of Assembly for the financial year 2018, the draft estimates of the development program for the financial year 2018, the draft estimates of the revenue for the financial year 2018, the social sector investment program 2018, the public sector investment program Trinidad 2018, the public sector investment program Tobago 2018, the State Enterprises Investment Program 2018, the Review of the Economy 2017, Vision 2030, the National Development Strategy 2016 to 2030, Vision 2030, the National Performance Framework 2017 to 2020.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate are moved by a minister.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, having regard to the correspondence from the Speaker of the House in relation to the decision of the House on Friday, September 15, 2017, that the Gaming and Betting Control Bill 2016 and the Cybercrime Bill 2017 be referred to respective joint select committees for consideration, and that these committees be mandated to adopt the work of the joint select committees appointed in the second session, 11th Parliament, and report by March 31st, 2018. I beg to move that the Senate concur with the House of Representatives.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the Senate concur with the House of Representatives that the Gambling, Gaming and Betting Control Bill 2016 and the Cybercrime Bill 2017 be referred to respective joint select committees for consideration, and that these committees be mandated to adopt the work of the joint select committees appointed in the second session, 11th Parliament, and report by March 31st, 2018. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Public Business, Government Business, Bill second reading.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending September 30, 2018 be read a second time. For this budget presentation, we have chosen the theme, Changing the Paradigm, as these are unusual times which call for major changes in our thinking, our policies, our institutions, and in our approach to how we live as Trinbagonians. This new paradigm will call for serious adjustment from all sectors of society and from each of us. It calls for a greater sense of personal and collective responsibility. To paraphrase the words of President John F. Kennedy, we need to ask not what our country can do for us, but ask instead what we can do for our country. Changing the paradigm. Madam President, the characteristics of our current economic and financial paradigm include the continued overdependence on the energy sector, private sector's investment in retail and immediate consumption rather than manufacturing and export, a banking sector that supports consumption rather than investment, failure to develop an effective and efficient tax administration, and inefficient systems such as our procurement process. We have already started to address the weaknesses in the economy, as well as to create the paradigm which is a precondition for the restoration of economic stability and long-term growth. Before I move forward in placing this budget in the context of the global economy, let me first commend the outstanding professionalism and dedication of the public officials in the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning and Development, and the other ministries and departments who worked tirelessly in the preparation of the National Budget 2018. The global economy, Madam President. The latest projections are for global real GDP growth of around 3.5% in 2017 and 3.6% in 2018, up from an average of 3.2% in 2016, but a far cry from the pre-crisis levels, particularly for the advanced economies and the commodity-producing developing countries. Commodity exporting economies, most of which were plunged into adjustment mode to offset the sharp decline in commodity prices, are expected to slowly exit their recessions because of the steady increase in commodity prices. The recovery is likely to be slower for oil-producing economies such as ours, as oil prices are expected to make a much slower rebound. It is in this global context of weak or modest economic growth in many countries that Trinidad and Tobago must find its way. Madam President, the total revenue collected by the government in 2017 was some $10 billion less than budgeted. This was caused by weaker than expected performance in some sectors of the economy, the challenges faced by the government in divesting some assets, the underperformance of the revenue collection agencies. It is for this reason that a significant component of our fiscal policy will be to address tax administration. Madam President, development in the second half of 2017 confirmed the assessment of the recently concluded IMF Article 4 consultation mission that the TT economy is on the cusp of a moderate recovery. To ensure and support this turnaround, we need to redouble our efforts to reduce the large fiscal imbalance and to accelerate the structural reforms that are needed for economic diversification. The medium-term recovery will again be driven by the energy sector. However, the policies being put in place are expected to elicit a stronger response from the non-energy sector. Madam President, the initiatives being pursued, specifically in the area of natural gas, include a new tax regime to provide incentives for increased exploration and production, the gas sales agreement to be finalized with Venezuela, further exploration activity, and the continuation of technical work in the evaluation of the gas master plan. We are building capacity to guard against transfer pricing practices that erode potential revenue flows to Trinidad and Tobago, and it is our intention to bring legislation to the Parliament in 2018 that will strengthen our ability to address such commercial arrangements. Madam President, we need to introduce a number of fiscal reforms more in keeping with our global fiscal sustainability. Negotiations between the energy companies and the government are well advanced, and we expect to be in a position to present the new oil and gas fiscal regime before the end of this year. That said, Madam President, we recognize the urgent need to enhance revenue collection in other areas and to identify new revenue streams. Madam President, property values in Trinidad and Tobago have increased significantly since property valuations were last undertaken under the then existing land and building tax regime. Over the years, as property values increased, property taxes did not keep pace. The time has come when property owners must begin to contribute a share of these benefits to assist in financing the country's development and providing funds for the servicing of the communities in which their properties are located. Madam President, it is not the government's intention to introduce taxes which place too heavy a burden on the population, which is why the new tax regime under the Property Tax Act does several things. It introduces rates of tax that are lower than those that applied under the Land and Building Taxes Act and the Municipal Corporations Act. It introduces lower rates of tax for agricultural and residential property. It removes the discrimination that previously existed in the application of different rates and different assessments in different areas of the country. And it contains a provision that allows for a temporary or permanent waiver of tax for persons who are unable to bear the cost of the tax. We are confident that these measures will result in property tax rates that are reasonable and equitable. Madam President, currently Trinidad and Tobago is the home of a gaming industry worth approximately $15 to $20 billion, from which we collect very little tax. Actually, the rate of compliance by member clubs and amusement gaming operators is recorded to be less than 10% and 7% respectively. The proposed gaming legislation is to be laid in Parliament soon, and we are hopeful that with the support of our friends on the other side, who in fact crafted the bill, that legislation will be in place in 2018. In the interim, we propose to more rigorously enforce the current legislation, which provides some limited regulation of the industry. Madam President, the purpose of this debate is to provide for the service of Trinidad and Tobago, which requires the collection and management of the public revenue. We therefore need to talk about tax administration. Madam President, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has taken a decision to establish a semi-autonomous revenue authority, the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority, that will be responsible for the collection and protection of government revenue. Madam President, to those who ask why we cannot fix the problems by reforming the existing agencies, the Inland Revenue Division and the Customs and Excise Division, we should remind them that successive governments have tried and failed in that task, going back at least 30 years. The challenges in the current system were identified by a multi-stakeholder, non-political committee as follows: deficient human resource management, inadequate management capability, accountability, and training, inadequate staff development, training and accountability, lack of control over and accountability for budgetary allocations, inadequate employee compensation packages, high incidence of corruption and corrupt practices, inefficient systems for internal investigation and enforcement, inadequate information exchange and coordination between the administrations and the various taxes levied, poor customer relations, anti-business rules and regulations, lack of appropriate information technology systems, poor physical infrastructure and accommodation, deficiencies in the legislative framework. Madam President, those issues that could have been addressed within the present institutional, legislative, and regulatory context have been addressed, at least in part. For example, the government has made available impressive and modern physical accommodation, and extensive investments in both hardware and software have been made to improve the ICT capacity of the two agencies. On the other hand, Madam President, attempts have been made to address the other issues, but with little success. For example, countless appeals and requests have been made to the service commissions to fill vacant posts. However, in the face of inadequate responses, successive governments have had to resort to engaging employees on term contracts, a less than ideal arrangement. Significant investments have been made in training in all areas of deficiency, with little discernible improvement in the level of service to taxpayers. The relatively successful establishment of a sub-office in 1989 to introduce VAT was short-lived because of the reintegration of that sub-office back into the broader tax administration unit. Madam President, it is not only the structural and institutional inadequacies that hinder the effectiveness of our tax administration, there are also other issues relating to fairness, equity, and justice. A recent study undertaken by economists at the University of the West Indies estimated the tax gap in Trinidad and Tobago, that is, the difference between the taxes that should be collected and the taxes that are collected, to be between 11% and 18%. In financial terms, the gap was estimated to be between $12 billion and $15 billion. With corporation tax gap estimate being between 5.1 and 6.6 billion, and the VAT gap estimated to be between 1.9 and 2.4 billion dollars. An effective tax system is one in which taxpayers are motivated to freely comply. One of the criteria for such a system includes equitable distribution of the tax burden. In Trinidad and Tobago, there is serious concern regarding the equity in the administration of the taxes. There are many economic actors in the society who are earning a good living and are clearly avoiding their fair share of taxes while benefiting from the services provided by the state. In other words, we have wage earners who are relentlessly taxed by the week or the month, who may be living from paycheck to paycheck, while a wide range of persons making quite a good living are not bearing their share of tax. This is regressive and repressive. It is in this context, Madam President, that the government has looked at good practice options to address tax administration. Case studies have demonstrated the benefits of having a semi-autonomous revenue authority as the centerpiece of the tax administration system. A 2004 World Bank policy research paper has argued that the semi-autonomous revenue authority model, properly designed, can serve to improve tax administration in a rapid and comprehensive manner. Case studies researched by reputable international institutions have convinced us, Madam President, that a well-structured revenue authority not only facilitates coordination and collaboration between the two main tax collection offices, but also allows for the recruitment, assessment, and proper reward of specialized staff, which is not always possible in the traditional public service. Madam President, we will engage the national community, including labor and business organizations, in an outreach and education program with a view to sharing with them all aspects relating to the new institution. We propose to have the Revenue Authority operational in 2018. Permit me, Madam President, to enumerate some of the key provisions of the policy decision taken to establish the TTRA. In the transition, contrary to the noise that is out there, all current staff of the Inland Revenue Division and the Customs and Excise Division will have the option to transition to the TTRA at terms and conditions no less favorable than those they currently enjoy. Indeed, staff in the TTRA can expect job enrichment, greater scope for professional development, and enhanced terms and conditions. Pensions and other such benefits will transition with them. Staff who do not wish to transition to the TTRA will have the option of remaining in the public service. Madam President, there are obvious unsustainable weaknesses in the structure of central government's expenditure, particularly the explosive growth of transfers and subsidies. While we have made some headway in the area of fuel subsidies, more is required. Consistent with the need to cut our waste and duplication, the government has engaged the World Bank to conduct a public expenditure review, starting with the major areas of expenditure. The study will focus on improving the efficiency of our spending on health, education, and social services, and developing systems to improve targeting and preventing overlapping of our social safety network. We expect that implementation of measures to improve the efficiency and targeting of these subsidies and transfers could produce significant savings without depriving the deserving beneficiaries of these programs. Complementary to that expenditure, Madam President, the Expenditure Management Initiative, we anticipate greater efficiency and effectiveness with the full rollout shortly of the new procurement regime. Madam President, in seeking to walk the talk of diversification of the economy, we are focusing on 6 broad areas: business facilitation, export promotion, a business incentive program, business process outsourcing, yachting, and the creative industries. My colleagues will provide more detail on the actions we have taken in respect of the single electronic window, the introduction of an automatic system for the approval of construction permits, and the like. However, we recognize that more needs to be done in respect of business facilitation, and we are committed to getting it done. Madam President, there are several export promotion initiatives, including the licensing of Exim Bank as a forex trader to address the forex need of exporters. Our new business development incentive program, Madam President, is geared towards the stimulation of at least 500 small to medium-sized businesses through the allocation of $50 million in the 2018 budget for the provision of grants to support the vision of our entrepreneurs. Madam President, financial services is one of the sectors which our diversification strategy is focused on. We are therefore moving towards making Trinidad and Tobago a preferred location for business process outsourcing, BPO, and making Trinidad and Tobago an international finance center. The Trinidad and Tobago International Finance Center is in the process of expanding its BPO operations by attracting foreign BPO firms who will use local labor to service their offshore clients. A new yachting policy will be rolled out, laying the groundwork for the enhancement of the competitiveness of the Trinidad and Tobago yachting industry and niching this market as the premier destination for yacht repair services. Madam President, nothing could more starkly demonstrate the benefits of Trinidad and Tobago embarking on this path than the current hurricane season, which witnessed 2 successive Category 5 hurricanes, which wreaked havoc on our Caribbean and North American neighbors. The need is there, and we must move with dispatch to fill that need. In the creative industry sector, a potential revenue earner is an artist portfolio development program and the Export Ready Academy, which will assist local artists in the production, marketing, and export of their skills. Madam President, we continue to pursue innovations in tourism and agriculture, including the new incentives for farmers. Madam President, the Ministers of Trade and Agriculture, my colleagues, will elaborate on these exciting initiatives which have been and are being introduced in their respective areas to promote these objectives. For our housing market, we intend to shift the HDC's focus away from the provision of housing for middle-income earners and return this activity to the private sector where it belongs. We will support this activity through grants to persons who construct and sell such accommodation in accordance with government policy. We will return HDC's focus to the provision of affordable housing for lower and lower middle-income families with an emphasis on rental accommodation. This shift, Madam President, will be driven by a ministerial oversight committee. Madam President, apart from the road infrastructure and initiatives to ease traffic congestion, we will introduce a demerit point system as part of the traffic regulation system. We will also reform and modernize the motor vehicle registration system and replace the aging fleet of Public Transport Service Corporation. Madam President, while we recognize that the removal of the fuel subsidy will impact the providers of goods and services, including those persons in the private sector who provide public transportation services, let us not forget that the government, even in these trying times, continues to lend support to the maxi-taxi owners and operators who enjoy exemptions from motor vehicle tax, VAT, and import duties. The objectives of those reliefs is to assist in keeping the price of public transportation affordable to all. Increasing access to health care will be achieved through continued construction of the Arima and Point Fortin hospitals and the commissioning in 2018 of the Couva Medical and Training Facility. Come in. Madam President, we are improving the delivery systems and processes in the suite of social sector programs while ensuring that the social expenditure is well targeted to cater for the vulnerable and defenseless. Madam President, we are now positioning sports tourism as a viable incipient industry for economic diversification. We plan to focus on 3 major revenue-generating avenues: sports services, sport events, and sports infrastructure, given that these areas require very little capital investment as a result of the already existing infrastructure and framework. Madam President, addressing crime and criminality will continue to be our #1 priority, given its implication for the quality of life of our citizens and for the safety and security of persons wishing to visit or do business in Trinidad and Tobago. To this end, this government is placing even greater effort in the incoming year into crime reduction. We recognize the need for stronger collaboration between the government and non-governmental sectors, law enforcement agencies, and the populace. Madam President, we propose to launch the National Crime Prevention Program, which will constitute a holistic approach to crime fighting. It will impact crime prevention through community empowerment, which is a key factor in returning safety and security to the national economy. National community. It will employ resources in law enforcement, government ministries, and communities across Trinidad and Tobago. Some focus areas will be the strengthening of our crime detection capability and enhancing our border control efforts. Madam President, as we continue to refine our national security strategy, we are pursuing a number of initiatives which are either in the planning or implementation phases. We are optimistic that our efforts have begun to bear fruit, and we stand committed to continue to invest resources strategically and work with our partners in making crime prevention a reality, crime reduction a reality. Madam President, I now turn my attention to Tobago. The budgetary allocation for the Tobago House of Assembly for fiscal 2018 is $2.1936 billion, of which $1.86 billion will be for recurrent expenditure, $315.683 million for capital expenditure, and $18 million for the unemployment relief program. This allocation to the Assembly represents 4.34% of the national budget. Further, the THA has obtained an international credit rating, and we are presently in discussions with the THA with respect to giving approval to the Assembly to borrow money in 2018 to accelerate its development program. A further $1.09 billion is allocated to facilitate work in Tobago by government ministries. This will cater for ongoing construction on the Old Grange and Roxborough police stations, the construction of a desalination plant, and the expansion of the power generating capacity at Cove Power Plant. Critically, Madam President, draft legislation to grant self-government and a greater devolution of powers to Tobago is before Cabinet, and in this fiscal year we will table the legislation before Parliament. The budgeted revenue for 2018 is predicated on an oil price of $52 and a gas price of $2.75 per MMBTU. It should be noted that our assumed oil price is below the International Monetary Fund forecast of $56.20 per barrel for 2018 and lower than the current oil price forecast made by the World Bank, the United States Energy Information Administration, and the International Energy Agency. Madam President, based on these assumptions, we are projecting total revenue of $45.741 billion, broken down as follows: oil revenue $6.412 billion, non-oil revenue of $32.910 billion, capital revenue of $6.419 billion. Total expenditure, net of capital repayments and sinking fund contributions, is estimated at $50.501 billion. Madam President, we are continuing to build an inclusive society with major allocations of expenditure for 2018 on security, education, and health. The specifics are as follows: education and training, $7.2905 billion, national security, $6.2371 billion, health, $6.0278 billion, Public Utilities, 3.5454 billion. Works and Transportation, 3.0912 billion. Rural Development and Local Government, 1.8494 billion. Housing, 1.0052 billion. And Agriculture, 544 million. Madam President, as we move towards rebalancing our fiscal accounts and ensuring that our expenditure is brought in alignment with our revenue, while at the same time creating the necessary conditions for putting the economy on a path of sustainable growth and development, we are utilizing all available financing options for transitioning the economy. We propose to secure from the domestic capital market the sum of 4.5 billion or 3% of GDP. We propose also to continue our sale of assets program, including repayments relating to the CLF CLICO rescue plan, and to withdraw from the restructured Heritage and Stabilization Fund to generate an amount of approximately 7.5 billion or 4.4% of GDP. Madam President, the measures presented in the budget for fiscal year 2017-2018 provides for the following. Removal of the incentives currently available to CNG passenger vehicles with engine sizes exceeding 15.99 cc. Increase in motor vehicle tax and customs duty on private passenger vehicles with engine sizes exceeding 1599 cc and not exceeding 1999 cc by 25%. Duty and tax exemption on all motorcycles with engine sizes under 300 cc. Increase in the motor vehicle inspection fee from $165 to $300. Harmonization of customs import duty on all tires at 30% new or used, with the exception of tires for buses and lorries, which will remain at 15%. Implementation of an environmental tax of 20% per tire on all tires imported into Trinidad and Tobago. Increase in oil wholesale margins for premium, super, and regular gasoline from 14.5 cents to 19.5 cents, and for diesel and kerosene from 9.5 cents to 14.5 cents, which will increase the price of super gasoline from $3.58 per litre to $3.97 per litre, and the price of diesel from $2.30 per litre to $3.41 per litre. Introduction of a 12.5% royalty rate on the extraction of all gas, condensate, and oil based on fair market value set by the Petroleum Pricing Committee. Increase the base corporation tax bracket for all companies to 30%. Introduce a new tax bracket of 35% for commercial banks. Increase the rate of duty on all mechanical games of chance for gambling from 20% to 40%. Introduce a 10% tax on all cash winnings by the National Lotteries Control Board. Introduce a flat device tax of $120,000 on electronic roulette devices. Increase the gaming tax from $3,000 to $6,000 in respect of each amusement game. Increase the taxes of gaming tables and other devices by public members' clubs. In fact, Madam President, we propose to double the rates that currently apply. Increase the license fees for certain categories of private hospitals as follows. Those with less than 30 beds, $25,000 per year. Those with beds between 30 and 60, $50,000 per year. And those with more than 60 beds per year, $100,000 per year. Increase the penalty for persons found guilty of an offense under the Private Hospitals Act from $10,000 to $100,000, and increase the penalty for a continuing offense from $200 per day to $1,500 per day. Increase in reimbursement of the expenditure and the cost of work per room from 25% to 15%, and increase the maximum reimbursement limit from $750,000 to $1.5 million under the Trinidad and Tobago Hotel Guest Room Stock Upgrade Program. Under the Small Approved Tourism Properties Program, we propose to increase the reimbursement of the expenditure and the cost of work per room from 20% to 40%, as well as the maximum reimbursement limit from $75,000 to $150,000. We will increase the government subsidy of interest charged by financial institutions to such entities for new and restructured loans from 2% to 5%. We will re-establish the export allowance to manufacturers. We will establish an agricultural financial support program with grants for new and existing farmers up to $100,000 per farmer. Introduction of a house construction incentive program up to $100,000. To encourage private developers, this is the house construction program, to encourage private developers to construct houses to satisfy the current demand for affordable housing. Madam President, this budget is about changing the paradigm. The paradigm that whets our appetite for imported goods over indigenous products. The paradigm that causes us to resist change in business processes. The paradigm that demotivates us from paying tax. The paradigm that fuels our reliance on oil and gas. The paradigm that propels us into the workforce rather than stimulates us to develop our entrepreneurial skills. The paradigm that leads us to believe that we are all entitled to have jobs, but that it is okay for us to not actually earn our salaries. That old paradigm is no longer consistent with our present economic circumstance and stifles our inherent creativity and ingenuity. The new paradigm calls for collective support and action, a cultural shift, responsibility of all of us, both in this chamber and outside of this chamber. We must embrace this transformation. The time is now. Sustainable growth is within our reach. Vision 2030 is on the horizon. It has been an honor, Madam President, to make this presentation. I thank you and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending on the 30th day of September 2018 be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, before I commence my contribution to the bill to provide for the service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending on the 30th day of September 2018, may I extend my warmest congratulations to the Honorable Kamala Persad-Bissessar, Leader of the Opposition and Political Leader of the United National Congress, and the alternative Prime Minister for this Republic on an excellent and brilliant contribution to the 2018 budget and an absolutely clear vision and roadmap outlined to achieve economic recovery and social development through innovation, creativity, and transformative measures aimed at driving our thrust towards the fourth industrial revolution in this country. Madam President, may I also take this opportunity to congratulate my other colleagues who made very decisive contributions and incisive contributions. And I also want to take the opportunity to recognize the Senator, the Honorable Allyson West, who is making her, I would imagine, maiden contribution to the budget here this evening. Maiden budget contribution. Madam President, we are living in absolutely dangerous times. And if we are to avoid growing disharmony, social calamity, and possible civil unrest in our beautiful Twin Island Republic state, we must be very cautious about the choices we make when applying fiscal measures and policies to address our country's current economic challenges. Indeed, we should be embarking upon a course of development that would lead ultimately to a more equal, more just, more peaceful, and more dignified society. Madam President, it was the late Martin Luther King Jr. who said some 50 years ago that we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are no longer considered more important than people. The gap between the rich and everyone else is now wider than ever, and the drive to achieve productive employment with strong social protection provision appears to have been thrown into reverse gear as this PNM government seeks to reinvent itself as an enabler and facilitator rather than a provider. There is a growing sense of disillusionment, of betrayal, bewildering frustration, and corroding bitterness, leading to fear and anxiety in a population whose dreams for a brighter and better tomorrow are increasingly being shattered, and whose collective hopes and aspirations are being completely obliterated. The economic framework under which this country currently operates has generated an unprecedented concentration of economic power and wealth in the hands of a smaller or a small number of people. They are the super elite, the group that the celebrated political sociologist C. Wright Mills referred in his classic work, The Power Elite. This has been compounded by the absence of a clear and well thought out economic strategy to lift this society out of its current economic doldrums. It is a challenge, if not urgently addressed and resolved, will ultimately deliver our economy and country firmly and completely into the arms of the International Monetary Fund. There is every indication, Madam President, that we have already been delivered into the arms of the great economic Satan, the IMF. At present, the rate of decline of this country's foreign exchange reserves, which stood at US $8.5 billion at the end of September 2017, and given our high propensity to import, we are looking at a recipe for economic chaos and disaster. The country has got to pause for a cause. We are on the wrong road. Under this PNM regime, the country is heading in the wrong direction. Only someone suffering from a severe bout of the hubris syndrome would not be able to discern the inevitable catastrophe awaiting our beloved country if we do not change course and rethink public policy. Madam President, if we are to secure decent jobs, secure homes, a safe environment, a better future for our children, a government that listens and positively responds to the people's concern, then we are heading towards an inescapable precipice and death trap. Time is fast running out. The truth is that prosperity for all cannot be delivered by any IMF-inspired austerity-thinking politicians, rent-seeking companies, and or selfish bankers. What is needed urgently is a New Deal which would focus on economic growth, productive, well-paying jobs, and reducing income inequality in our country. Fiscal policy must be used to generate internal-led growth and promote exports to secure new revenue streams for our nation, placing job creation and full employment at the center of its policy agenda. Fiscal and policy and monetary policy, Madam President, must work in tandem to finance major capital investment projects and programs that would create social cohesion and genuine sustainable development. In promoting sustainable development, we must take measures which can be implemented through a clear national plan. In this regard, the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, codified in a series of goals, targets, and indicators what sustainable development should be. What we need to achieve, Madam President, and to achieve these growing demands and obligations require bold and inspired political leadership, which is clearly absent in this hopeless, clueless, and visionless PNM government. Madam President, austerity measures under this government will only result in more harm than good. The imposition of this neoliberal model on the population by this embezzling, Rowley-led government will only lead to rising inequality, continued negative economic growth, and parlous social conditions, which are already manifesting themselves in rising crime, deteriorating healthcare services, declining educational standards, accelerating poverty, marginalization, and exclusion. Madam President, the PNM government is faced with the twin evils of growing budget deficits and rising debt levels, which have assumed frightening proportions as this country embarks upon a program of borrowing to service existing loans. This, Madam President, ought to raise alarm bells. Madam President, let's look at fiscal sustainability. Fiscal sustainability is the ability of a government to ensure that prudent levels of revenues are realized in order to facilitate its projected expenditure and investment initiatives and programs for the budgeted fiscal year in question. We on this side of the House will demonstrate the inability of this government to achieve fiscal sustainability and fiscal capacity in 2018. Madam President, the PNM government has predicated its 2018 budget on an oil price of US $52 a barrel and a gas price of $2.75 per MMBTU. in comparison to 2017, when it was $48 US and $225 per MMBTU. Madam President, the IMF has suggested in its latest oil forecast for 2018, issued in its World Economic Outlook in October, a price of $50 US per barrel. The EIA in its September 2017 review forecast oil at US $49.58 per barrel. JP Morgan, a reputable investment firm in the United States, has also forecasted an oil price for 2018 of US $42 on the basis that shale oil production would grow, whilst OPEC's oil production cut has no exit strategy for 2018. Madam President, the reality in 2017 is that oil prices average US $49.19 in comparison to the projected estimated 2017 forecast of $48 per barrel, and a gas price average of $3 per MMBTU compared to US $225 per MMBTU projected by the government. Madam President, in the 2017 midterm review, which the government presented to this Parliament in 2016, an array of measures were adopted aimed at recalibrating government's revenue estimates on the basis of an adjusted oil price of $35 and a gas price of $2. Madam President, the fiscal measures also introduced by the government in the midterm review included unconscionable increases in the prices of super gasoline and diesel fuel by additional 15%, and other measures. Madam President, given the patent miscalculations and utter failure by the Rowley-led government to properly assess and evaluate the volatility of international oil and gas prices, as well as the collective opinions of reputable forecasters and key international stakeholders in the global oil industry, it is our considered judgment that the oil and gas prices forecast for 2018 is a strategic move by this government to create the flexibility so as to facilitate its further assault on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Madam President, the burning question that is on the lips of the vast majority of our people is what contingencies do the government have in place to safeguard the national interest in fiscal 2018 when these policies and measures fail? Madam President, when we look at the declining fiscal capacity and rising debt levels in our country, what do we see? We see a huge budgetary deficit of $12.6 billion in fiscal 2017, representing, Madam President, the largest fiscal deficit since 1956. Given a projected deficit of $4.7 billion in 2018, as well as the government's inability to realize, we are predicting their inability to realize their $6.4 billion in capital revenue receipts. Madam President, the estimated budget deficit could well reach $11.2 billion in 2018. Madam President, could you imagine? Between 17 and 18, we could reach some $24 billion in budget deficits. Madam President, where are we going with this? When we take into account, Madam President, the high average propensity to import, it demonstrates the gravity of the deteriorating economic situation in our country. Madam President, at 2017, our GDP remains at the same level as at 2007. That is approximately $148 billion at nominal prices. Our imports in 2007 stood at 31% of GDP. Today, in 2017, it is at 52%, and our GDP at nominal prices remains at $148 billion. Madam President, when is this hemorrhaging going to stop? This country faces catastrophic repercussions, particularly as it concerns our foreign exchange reserves. Madam President, it has been estimated that when they came to office, they inherited an $11.5 billion in reserves, or the equivalent of 12.9 months in port cover. But, Madam President, what has happened? In less than 2 years, we are down to $8.5 billion and only 10 months cover. At the rate that we are going, within 20 months, we will be zero and we'll be heading towards the IMF at the rate that we are going. Madam President, recently, the central bank, in its 2017 September bulletin, revealed that both balance of payments on the capital and the current account were in deficit. Madam President, this represents an outflow of our foreign exchange by key players in this economy. When we look at what is taking place with the Republic Bank and financial holdings, we understand from a report in the newspapers that they bought a bank in Ghana called HFC, and we are being told that they need $120 million to inject fresh capital, Madam President, into that bank. Where is Republic Bank going to get that money to inject into the Bank of Ghana? Madam President, this is a very serious matter. It is a matter that I believe requires the central bank intervention, because the central bank distributes our scarce foreign exchange to commercial banks. And these commercial banks supposed to distribute those things to maintain stability in our economy, not to maintain their subsidiaries in other countries. So, Madam President, we are calling on the central bank to perform an urgent special forensic audit on Republic Bank holdings to determine whether this country's scarce foreign exchange resources amounting to millions of dollars issued by the central bank are being used by others or being frittered away by the rejuvenated parasitic oligarchy. Madam President, these resources are distributed, as I said, by the commercial banks. And we know that this bank, called Republic Financial Holdings, has a subsidiary overseas. So we are calling on that bank to explain to this country how these activities that they are involved in overseas are contributing to a net inflow and not a net outflow of foreign exchange. Madam President, it is very serious. And you know why, Madam President? The total public debt of our country stands at close to $95 billion, with its external component at $22 billion. The debt to GDP is racing towards 65%. Madam President, when you combine the debt with the fiscal challenges that we have and the huge, voracious appetite of this government to borrow, we are heading towards the debt trap, and we are heading towards the International Monetary Fund. Madam President, if you look at interest payments for the last 3 years, you will see, Madam President, where it is rising. In 2015, $3.4 billion. In 2016, it gone to $3.7 billion. And at the end of 2017, $4.5 billion. Madam President, the debt of every woman man and child is equivalent to $70,423, Madam President. This is a looming catastrophe in this country, Madam President. Madam President, when we look at the kind of austerity measures that they have introduced here, it is because of the incompetence and the anti-people's philosophy of this regime called the PNM. Madam President, there is an explosion of fear, disappointment, disenchantment across large segments of our country. The working people are under severe pressure in this land because of the kind of measures introduced by this government. Madam President, we must do everything we can to avoid, at all costs, any calamity in this country. That is what our duty is. But the working class and the middle class and the vulnerable are traumatized, severely traumatized by the measures introduced by this government, Madam President. This regime, Madam President, has seen thousands of workers being thrown on the breadline, Madam President, over the last few months, 24 months to be precise. I wouldn't burden you with the names of the companies and the number of workers, Madam President, only to say that thousands of workers has been dumped on the garbage heap of this society. Madam President, these measures are bringing workers pain and hardship. These measures are insensitive and cruel, Madam President. They are having deleterious and debilitating impact on the poor and the working people. Madam President, we are therefore proposing a new rethink of development is needed in this country. A new policy direction, a sine qua non, to rekindle growth, generate jobs, and protect the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, and the marginalized in our country. Madam President, a new mandate is absolutely required. The PNM social contract has been breached. Fresh elections should be called in this country. The government has not only broken its social contract with the people, but has lost its political legitimacy to rule this country. Madam President, I would like, Madam President, to deal with the issue of the challenges in the declining economy. Some of the challenges. Madam President, there is the alarming decline, if you are not aware, in the labor force participation rate in this country, which is a cause for serious concern. The labor force participation rate has been steadily declining over the last few years. And this declining participation trend has worsened over the last 24 months. Madam President, it stood at 59.8% at the end of the first quarter of 2017, the lowest since 1995. This participation rate pales into insignificance when you compare it with 87% labor force participation rate in Iceland, 70% in Belize, 65% in Jamaica, 74% in the Bahamas, and Madam President, 74.8% in Sweden. Madam President, there are several causative factors responsible for this relatively low labor force participation rate, inclusive of aging population, an aging population. Some of these include a high level of school dropouts, the astronomical murder rate, which may also have led to the resignation of spouses from their jobs to look after dependents, and, Madam President, an exponential growth in the number of discouraged workers. These factors, Madam President, were highlighted at a conference that the government held recently at the Hyatt Regency. Madam President, whatever may be the factors responsible for this decline, the truth is that the low level of labor force participation rate is having a negative effect on national output and productivity, and consequently economic growth and social development. Madam President, when the situation of declining labor force participation is combined with the murder of over 6,400 able-bodied young men and women whose average age is around 29 years since 2006, one begins to fully understand the profound impact of crime and violence on the productive sector of our national economy. Madam President, there's also the phenomenon of underemployment. We have estimated a loss of some $2 billion annually in economic value, as well as the rising unemployment rate in our country. Madam President, we have to do something about the labor force participation rate decline, the rise in the dependency rate, coupled with absolutely no change to the retirement age. The total outlay of pensions will continue to rise on the already overburdened shoulders of a shrinking employment force. Madam President, employment declined from 623,300 at the end of 2015 to 611,100 at the end of the first quarter of January to March 2017. The working class has not been able to secure, through collective bargaining, any new collective agreements since the arrival of this Red and Ready Brigade. Indeed, Madam President, the latest central bank economic bulletin revealed a major contraction in what is called the index of average earnings, which has declined by 3.1% during the first half of 2017. Madam President, you know what that means? It means that workers are becoming poorer in this country. Madam President, in the face of these rising prices manifested in these measures announced by the government, Madam President, comes the announcement from both the Minister of Public Utilities and the chairman of the RIC that they have already taken a decision, particularly the chairman of the RIC, to increase rates for electricity and water even before a public hearing has taken place in this country. They have already predetermined, Madam President, that there will be an increase in water and electricity rate. That's a travesty of justice. It's almost like an illegality that is taking place, Madam President. Madam President, I'm sorry that my friend is not here, the Minister of Labor, because the Honorable Minister of Labor promised this country in October of 2016 that there will be a provision in which a Canadian company named Hire Pro Drivers would be able to identify some 35,000 long-haul trucking vacancies in Canada that could be filled by nationals of this country, and even hinted the strong possibility of workers even securing permanent residence. Madam President, I'm sorry that the minister is not here, because I wanted to ask the minister, was that a hoax, or was it designed to mama guy and fool the working class? She has to answer. But Madam President, amidst all that is going on, we cannot escape the importance of social dialogue. We have to engage our social partners. We have to bring all our social partners together in meaningful discussions and establish what is called a social compact that will deal with the issues in addressing or facing our nation. Madam President, I recall in their manifesto they gave about 16 to 17 manifesto promises to Labour. Not one has been fulfilled. They haven't kept one promise, Madam President. Every promise they have made have failed. They have failed to implement those manifesto promises. So, Madam President, when we examine what is taking place under this government, we see that this government has been completely kidnapped by the super elite in this country. And, Madam President, as I speak about the super elite, I want to tell you what I have observed, and I want to share it with you. Madam President, you know what is happening? You may have read the following. A company by the name of Massey recently obtained a bureau de charge license to buy and sell foreign currency notes, coins, and traveler's checks. This is despite the fact that this same company, Madam President, is an authorized dealer and has a license issued by the central bank to conduct business as a non-bank financial institution. So they now have 2 licenses, and they break the queue in order to get up front. And they get this license, Madam President. Madam President, I want to ask the question through you. What is the link between that Neil and Massey, or Massey Communication, and the decision to sell their loss-making Massey Communication to TSTT for $215 million? Is there a link between those 2 transactions? I ask the question, Madam President, because, Madam President, up to this time, no due diligence has been made public about this transaction. It is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. This government is a secret society. They do not provide information to the public, Madam President. Madam President, there's another matter that the public would like information on, and it deals with this. It occurred in May of 2015. The public would like to know whether a board member of the same conglomerate obtained free of charge several computers and other equipment for delivery to a member of parliament on the ruling party's bench to fight the last general elections. How has this transaction been accounted for at the Massey conglomerate, which is a publicly trading company, Madam President? Has it been written off on the asset register? Are the auditors and shareholders aware of this transaction? What type of personnel information is involved here? Madam President, these are matters that we would like the government as well as Massey to answer. Madam President, it has been brought to our attention, and I want to let you know as well, because there appears to be an attempt to hijack our democracy. There is a clear and present danger involving the government's systematic undermining of our country's independent institutions. Information has reached us that the Public Service Commission recently took the unprecedented and astonishing decision to appoint a junior member of staff who is a contract officer as the new Chief Elections Officer of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. What is even worse, we understand that that person who was appointed to a public office as a contract officer is the first cousin of the Minister of Public Administration. We want clarification on this. And we want to know, why is the Public Service Commission breaking and breaching well-established regulations in the public service? Madam President, I cannot detain you any longer. I think I have to wrap up, and I want to do so by telling you, the IMF inspired austerity fiscal measures are disproportionately aimed at placing the burden of the fiscal adjustment on the middle class and the vulnerable strata of our society. These PNM programs of fiscal choices in the 2018 budget will not lead to growth, expansion, development, and transformation. Madam President, I want to tell you and this Honorable House that a budget is not merely about taxing to bring revenue and expenditure into fiscal balance and prosperity. Professor Joel Semrod said that prosperity depends not only on the level of taxes, but also on what the money is used for, Madam President. Madam President, I also want to close by sharing these very powerful words of wisdom issued from the pen of the third President of the United States of America, and the gentleman who wrote the majestic words on the Declaration of the American Independence, Thomas Jefferson. And I think the minister in the Ministry of Finance would do well to note these words of wisdom. The care of human life and happiness, not their destruction, is the first and only object of government. That's the only object you have. Thomas Jefferson said that the care of human life and happiness and not their destruction is the first and only object of good government, Madam President. Madam President, we cannot tell the government what to do. We can only advise them. We think that the time has come when they have lost their legitimacy to run this country. I think that the government should step aside, call fresh elections, and let the people decide, Madam President, on the way forward. I thank you very much for allowing me to do this.
Senator Shrikissoon.
Thank you, Madam President. I must say that I appreciated that welcome. Thank you, Madam President, for allowing me and for recognizing me and allowing me to contribute. For allowing me to contribute to this debate. I'd really like to take this opportunity on behalf of the independent bench to welcome Senator Haynes, Senator Hussain, and Senator Obika, if I pronounced that correctly, to the Senate and to be part of the Senate family. Yeah, I thought it would be a good place to welcome them. I also would like to thank my colleagues on the independent bench and my coordinator for allowing me the opportunity to commence debate on the budget presentation, Fiscal Package 2018, on behalf of our bench. And so I trust that I do them well and this country well. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work and effort of the Minister of Finance and his minister in the Ministry of Finance and their team and all public officials who aided in preparing the budget documents for fiscal 2018. And I think that that's an effort that we need to also recognize the hardworking members of our country. But at this time, I want to get straight into my presentation so that I would be able to manage time a little bit better. Madam President, over the years, we've had several budget themes, and I've noted in the budget presentation of the minister that he made a reference to a 5-year cycle of data being presented, and that was in keeping with the UN Statistics Division benchmark. And so I would like to use the same 5-year benchmark so that I would be able to cross administrations. In 2012, we had a budget theme, from steady foundation to economic transformation. 2013, stimulating growth, generating prosperity. 2014, sustaining growth, securing prosperity. 2015, empowering our people through sustained economic growth and prosperity. 2016, restoring confidence and rebuilding trust. Let's do this together. 2017, shaping a brighter future, a blueprint for transformation and growth. And 2018, changing the paradigm, putting the economy on a sustainable path. Madam President, if you analyze the macroeconomic situation of our country, you would realize that over the period 2012 to 2015, we've had declines we had a relatively stable GDP, but from 2016 to 2018, our GDP has been on the decline. How is it that after all this, how is it at the end of this level of expenditure that we would have put into our economy, we are suffering from a declining GDP? Our debt position, as Senator Mark says, is shooting through the roof. So that you have a debt expansion over the period 2012 to 2017 of over 45%. As Senator Mark says again, net foreign reserves falling, a depreciating currency, a level of productivity lower than that of 2012, according to the review of the economy, declining credit ratings, continuous budget deficits. Mr. Vice President, my point is this. How can we present documents in this House and talk about sustainable economic growth, transformation, securing a pathway, a future, when we actually have in result decreases in GDP, contraction of the economy, increasing public debt, decreasing foreign reserves, declining productivity, falling credit ratings, and a 9 consecutive year of budget deficits? It is saying to me that the macroeconomic position, the result of it, is not in keeping with the intent of budget documents. And if we cannot achieve, and this is the result of the output of those policies, it is simply saying to me, we are doing it wrong. We are doing it wrong. We cannot prescribe a theme and have results that's inconsistent with the theme and say that we are on the right path. Senator Mark touched on budget deficits, and I would like to touch on that as well. As I said before, this is our 9th consecutive year of budget deficits. And I said in my opening presentation, Budget 2016 presentation, that we need to capture the runaway horse of government expenditure. We need to do it. And so far, it has been left unbridled. What is more is that over the period 2012 to 2015, we had increases in expenditure greater than that of increases in revenue. And that's why we had the deficit. What we're having now is decreases in expenditure, for which I would like to commend the government, bringing it down from a high of 59 to probably 50 right now. But what you have is a fall in revenue at a faster rate than the reduction in expenditure. So while 2012 to 2015, we had increasing expenditure beyond increase in revenue, in 2016 to 2018, we are having decreases in expenditure at a lower rate than the decreases in the revenue. So in either way, we are having deficits. And what has happened here is that the plans are now, for Trinidad and Tobago, crystallized and sunk as budget deficits. We are having it no matter what the economic condition is. And I'm very much concerned about that. And to finance this budget deficits, we're having a sale of assets program that seems to be a fixture of Trinidad and Tobago's economic plan. Where are we going after all the assets are sold? And it's simply saying that expenditure has run away from revenue. And I just want to touch on this point for a brief moment in terms of creating deficits. We've heard in this Honorable House by the Minister in the Ministry of Finance that estimated revenue is about 45 billion. But when you want to talk about budget deficits, you have to talk about core revenue versus expenditure, not core revenue plus financing. If you want to bring this economy back together, you have to bring it to a place where core revenue is equal at least the expenditure, and then you can have a turn. Anytime somebody is presenting a budget deficit in this Honorable House and core revenue is not equal to at least at a bare minimum expenditure, there cannot be a turn of macroeconomic statistics in this country. So as long as core revenue continues to continues to be less than expenditure, we are having problems, because if you choose to finance it through sale of assets, you are diluting the asset structure of Trinidad, and that's not sustainable.
All right.
We've heard that the budget deficit for 2018, sorry, is in the vicinity of about 6 or 7 billion. In 2017, we had a budget, we realized a budget deficit of close to $12 billion. If you analyze what really happened in 2017, current revenue was 36.13 billion, expenditure 50.48 billion, deficit 14.34 billion, financing, which is not revenue, financing 1.7 billion, bringing the deficit that we realized in the vicinity of 12. So that's the reality. What's happening in 2018? Budget expenditure 50.5 billion, core revenue 37.3 billion, deficit $13 billion, in where expenditure outstrips revenue, financed by borrowing 4.5 billion, capital revenue an estimate 6.5, leaving a gap of 2 and probably a dip into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to finance that deficit. So for a realized deficit of 12 billion in 2017, we have a projected deficit of 13 billion before financing. How can we fix an economy with that level of expenditure outstripping revenue? And a debt profile that's shooting through the roof, which brings me to my next point, debt profile. Madam President, or Mr. Vice President, sorry, since over the years, we've had an increase in the debt expansion of this country. Over the period 2015 to 2017, we've had external debt almost doubling, 13 billion to 23 billion. Domestic borrowing increasing by approximately 33%, and taking net public sector debt up over the period by close to 25%. I want to remind Senator Khan of this statistic when we first debated borrowing limits in 2016. He gave an assurance that the debt profile of this country would not exceed 65% of GDP, up to 65% if he said. Well, as it is, we are at 63%. And according to the estimates of revenue, borrowing this year will total just over 6 billion, which will take us well beyond the 65% if GDP remains the same, which more than likely it will in a contracting economy. So I really want to urge some element of restraint with respect to borrowing. And why am I urging restraint with respect to borrowing? Because that is the way we go in. When government expenditure exceeds revenue, there are two ways that you could borrow. You could borrow externally, or you could borrow from the domestic market. When you borrow externally, there's a commitment in foreign exchange, which is our reserve that's actually falling. And with the decline in credit ratings across the world that has been presented for Trinidad and Tobago, you'll be borrowing at a higher rate. That's if you go externally. And if you go internally, meaning on the domestic market, which is really where the problem is, when you borrow domestically from the commercial banks, the first point is you crowd private sector investment out by competing for the same bit of funds, the same sector that we are trying to build a robust economy through. The second point with respect to borrowing on the domestic market, if we follow what's going on through the draft financial stability report of 2016 by the central bank, you'd realize that in Trinidad and Tobago, there was an increase in debt expansion among the citizens. And given the harsh economic times that are confronting us, non-performing loans is increasing in the commercial banking sector because of the inability to service the loans. When consumers have the inability to service their debt, the banks have to carry a higher liquidity profile or structure in order to sustain this level of default. But what happens is as the banks choose to carry or has to carry this liquidity, this increase in liquidity, you have now investments from the government papers, treasury notes, coming into commercial banks now for funding. So the banks have a requirement now in a position to say, hey, listen, we have to carry higher liquidity reserves to fund the non-performing loans. But here it is, we also have a request from government at the same time as we carry increased buffers for access for funding, for increased funding. So what does that do? It weakens the asset structure and liquidity profile of commercial banks. Where am I going with this? As revenue falls for the government, credit ratings fall. Should the banks run into a liquidity problem, they cannot attract the value of the paper that they're holding from the government because credit ratings are down, and so they'll have to sell it at a discounted rate. And if the revenue anticipation of the government does not materialize, then there may be delayed payments on this. What are we creating? In borrowing on the domestic market, we are creating a systemic financial risk to the entire economy of Trinidad and Tobago. So there is caution. While runaway expenditure needs to be financed, it has implications if you borrow externally for the foreign exchange rate, and internal and on the domestic market for the systematic financial risk that sovereign debt impairment presents to Trinidad and Tobago. This is where we are, and that's coming from central bank, not just my opinion. My third point is on CLF and borrowing. In Budget Statement 2017, we have heard, and through the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Senator West, shortfall in capital revenue. If you look at the estimates of borrowing, or the borrowing in 2017, you'll realize estimated borrowing was at 5 billion. It went up to 10 billion. It went up to 10 billion because the cash flows from the capital or the sale of assets of CLF did not materialize. So you increased the debt. But in 2018, we're now saying that we expect that this revenue to come in. And when this revenue comes in through the sale of asset program, it goes to fund expenditure. But if you anticipated it in 2017 and you did not get it and you went to the capital markets to borrow funds for it, when you actually attain the funds, why don't pay back the debt? Because all you had was a mismatch in cash flows. But instead, the bulk of all of it goes back to expenditure, and the debt profile that you incurred in 2017 to sustain the level of expenditure remains exposed. So actually, it was a benefit that they didn't get it so that you could bring it in 2018. And that's wrong. That cannot be right. If you budgeted for it, you didn't get it, you borrowed to supplement. Well, when the revenue comes in, allocate it to the debt and bring it back down. But no, we're not doing that. We pump all into expenditure again to manage the deficit. For a foreign exchange position. Our foreign exchange position with respect to Trinidad and Tobago economy, as Senator Mark was saying, our GDPs are 2007, our reserves are 2009 levels. When the foreign exchange rate was just about $6.32, and we had a stronger balance of trade. So where we are today is 9 years backward. We are at the same level of reserves with respect to Forex. Now, the thing about the Forex is the Forex reserve, foreign exchange reserve, is being presented on a twofold basis. We upset when the credit agencies downgrade us because we have a buffer of the foreign exchange reserve and we're saying it's large. But that's the same foreign exchange reserve we want to use to defend the currency. A foreign exchange reserve cannot be two things at the same time. It's either we make a decision, either we're going to use it as a buffer for the economy to back the debt profile, or we're going to defend the currency at a rate. We need to make up our minds. What is it we're really doing with respect to Forex? And while I'm on the note of Forex, I'm asking the Minister to take a note of this recommendation, and I don't know how possible or feasible it is. But there is a shortage of supply of the US dollars in the commercial banking system. And what happens is that there are those, whether abroad or locally, with Forex that they are willing to bring into Trinidad for investments that they're doing or that they are creating. However, they cannot bring it through the commercial banking system because they prefer a better rate for which they can attract. And more so, if they bring it into the commercial banking system, the purchaser on the Trinidad and Tobago side will not get it because it has to come in and then it has to be distributed. There is a possibility that if through the commercial banking sector, an arrangement could be made where a transaction between a purchaser and a seller can actually be facilitated on the terms negotiated by the purchaser and seller, so that when they bring it, even when it comes into Trinidad, even if the rate is high and the purchaser is willing to pay it, that they can achieve it. And what happens there is that when it comes into the commercial banking system, it can now be wired or transferred electronically. And so that may aid in the source of foreign exchange for trade. And I'm asking if that could be considered and if it could work with respect to foreign exchange. With respect to Tobago, there are 2 points I would like to make with respect to Tobago. One, if Tobago is to be used as a tourism destination, the air bridge and sea bridge must be reliable and dependent. We cannot have an air bridge that has an inadequate number of seats, untimely arrivals and departures, and most of all, presents a risk to people or to passengers flying. And the sea bridge, well, everybody knows in this house what is going on with the sea bridge, and it's not dependable right now. So that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. The second thing I want to address with respect to Tobago is the fact that Tobago has obtained a credit rating of its own. Mr. Vice President, total tax revenue in Tobago, 216 million. Non-tax revenue, 8.3 million. Total revenue, 224 million. Expenditure, as the minister says, recurrent expenditure, 1.86 billion. Development program, 0.32 billion. Total, 2.18 billion. Developmental works through government ministries, 1.09 billion. Total, 3.27 billion. Total revenue, 0.23 of a billion. Deficit, almost 3 billion. How can an island like Tobago have a deficit of 3 billion, which is funded by government, and obtaining a credit rating on its own? How come Tobago could have a credit rating of its own, but we can't have THA audited financial statements to date? Yes. What's the basis? What is the basis of that rating? What is the basis of that rating? We're not ready. To me, it is saying, Tobago, prepare yourself for a sale of assets program. Because when you cannot achieve, when you can't make the payment, is an asset in Tobago now that has to be sold for it. It cannot be that Tobago's dependence is on Trinidad and Tobago, and you're pushing Tobago out to take the risk on their own. It can't be funded through their normal arrangements. If it has to be funded, it's central government. And when Moody's and Standards and Poor's rates Trinidad and Tobago, don't they rate the islands together? So how come Tobago has a credit rating of its own when the source of funding is from central government? It cannot be right, and I will strongly object to any loan being undertaken by the THA on its own. At least bring your audited financial statements and show the capacity for repayment. Correct. Other than that, it's a responsibility of the Trinidad and Tobago government. Mr. Vice President, we've spoken about diversification. Diversification has two direct benefits to Trinidad and Tobago. One, to develop sectors in Trinidad and Tobago away from oil and gas. And the second benefit for diversification is as these sectors improve, the government revenue would increase through taxation measures. I want to say this. Increasing taxation in existing sectors is not a strategy of diversification. We need to build these sectors in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm going to just give a brief example of how we can build these sectors in Trinidad and Tobago. If you look at the review of the economy, Table 1, you'd realize that there are 20 sectors there that contributes to GDP. If you look at those sectors, you realize 2 of them would be electricity and water and gas. Take those 2 out, you have 18. Of the 18 sectors that remain, 6 of the sectors realized little or no improvement over the last 5 or 6 years. Take those out, you're down to 12. Of the 12 remaining sectors, you have 4 sectors that experience sharp declines. 1, agriculture. 2, mining and quarrying. 3, manufacturing. 4, trade and repairs. Those 4 sectors, although they declined, is saying that they have greater potential, they have capacity in them because they declined. So you have an unused potential in those sectors. And investments in those sectors can turn the performance of those sectors. We need policies and programs directly geared towards those declining sectors so as to increase the productivity of those sectors for which they would have demonstrated capacity before the decline. Those are the sectors we need to look at immediately. And if you look at the sectors that experience increases, and how you could do that before I go to the increases, is all you need to do is to look for new markets with respect to the declining sectors. Because if Trinidad and Tobago can't absorb the output of those sectors, just through the Ministry of Trade, help those companies find new markets. So that when declining industries or sectors, you need market development. And then if you look at so that's 4. And if you come down to the remaining 5 or 6, you'd realize that they experience sharp increases. The financial and services insurance sector, 50%. Administrative, 45. Trade and repairs, 22. Professional, scientific, and technical services, 20. What's my point? These sectors that are high performing is because they have a product that there is a demand for. So all you need to do is to continue to promote product development in the performing sectors. So when you go to markets, you have market development for the declining sectors and product development for the sectors that are improving. What you'll end up with is a total composition of sectors in the economy performing a little bit better. So all you need is specific proposals geared towards each one. You can't use a blanket policy. Have programs that will encourage, facilitate, and incentivize these sectors. Another point that I would like to raise is on competitiveness and confidence. Recently, the Global Competitive Index presented Trinidad and Tobago in a positive light with an increase in ranking from 94 to 83, a move of 9 places. And I wish to commend the government for this move. When my opening presentation in 2016, I asked the government, is it a possibility that we can facilitate this competitiveness into the upper half? And I would most certainly like to say from 94 to 83, it's a positive move, and I commend you for that. But what I would like to say with respect to that index, of the Global Competitive Index, is that if you look at the macroeconomic position, which is directly related to the presentation and the debate that's going on here, we saw a move we saw a change in rank from 114 to 112 this year. So we moved 2 places up. But if you look at the score, you'd realize that it was 3.9 in 2017 and 3.8 for this year, or 3.9 for 2016 and 3.8. We moved downward. So although the rank improved, our score or performance deteriorated. So rank alone is not good. You need to look at the score. But compare that position now to 2015 or 2016, you'll realize our macroeconomic position was 54th with a score of 4.9, which is saying that our macroeconomic position in Trinidad and Tobago is deteriorating via the trend. Why am I saying this is important? If you want to inspire confidence in investing in the Trinidad and Tobago economy, both through foreign direct investments and locally, the macroeconomic environment must be a positive one. No one wants to invest into an economy where the macroeconomic position is failing, or worsening, I should say, rather than failing. I'm sorry for using that word. It's worsening. Nobody wants to do that. And if you look at the problematic factors, while we were looking at the top, look at the ones to the bottom. Tax rates, moving from 1.6 to 2.9 as a problematic factor, 82% increase. Government instability, 1 to 2, 100% increase. Restrictive labor regulations, 2.3 to 3.6, 56% increase as problematic factors. Political instability and a worsening position of 48%. Those are problematic factors affecting the macroeconomic environment in Trinidad and Tobago. If we want investment, these factors must be addressed. My limited time left. Fiscal and other measures, as the government presented. Increase on hybrid vehicles with engine size 1599 and over. I thought when the legislation for hybrid vehicles came, it was supposed to bring about a change of behavior, and it was not a revenue-earning measure. Today, we're talking about revenue leakage with respect to hybrid vehicles. But just on a point to note here with respect... A hybrid vehicle, the vehicle regulates how it works. It's not a manual position of you choose to elect which source of energy you prefer to use. So with respect to hybrid vehicles, however, I noted in the budget presentation that it was geared towards luxury cars in that segment. Well, if that's the case, automobile dealers usually have 1,600, 1,700, 1,800 engine cars, which the population is more attracted towards because of the power. The size of the vehicle is more family-oriented. Take the exemption up to 1,800 or 1,899 and omit the last 100 cc's, which brings the luxury segment into it. What you will do is you will still keep hybrid vehicles affordable for family-sized sedans, and automobile dealers will still be encouraged to bring hybrid vehicles, which will turn the economy as they spend. So that's my recommendation. Coming down to the end, I can't go through everything here, but what I would like to say here, is that I was able to, and I have analyzed the government's fiscal measures and placed them into 4 categories. 1, measures for business development. 2, measures to increase revenue. 3, measures to increase expenditure. And 4, measures that will reduce expenditure. That's how I categorize the the fiscal measures. Measures for business development: increase in motor vehicle inspection, increase in the retail margin of fuel, and promotion of exports. I agree with that. Actually, it was in one of my presentations on hybrid vehicles that I cautioned that the fuel station sector is suffering because of the increase in business levy and green fund, which was a charge on their top line, reducing their margins. I'm pleased to see that this was addressed. The second category, revenue measures. Revenue measures in the budget: increase in taxes on hybrid vehicles, increase on import duty, new fiscal regime for the energy sector, increase in corporation tax, increase in corporation tax on commercial banks, increase in taxes on the gambling industry, increase in license fee for private hospitals, and reintroduction of property tax. 8 measures. Probably I may have omitted 1 or 2. Decreases in expenditure. 50.5 billion last year, 50.5 billion this year. No decreases. The only significant decrease on government side would have been the transfer of the subsidy away from being funded by the government and being fully funded now by the citizens. How can we have a budget with 8 measures? And when I check the increase in core tax revenue, it represents an increase of $4 billion in tax revenue if collected, which is 10% of core revenue. So we are spreading the burden of adjustment and placing $4 billion on 8 measures on the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, and government expenditure, which is the problem in the economy, stands up there. That's not sharing the burden of adjustment. So you have 8 measures to increase revenue, no measure to significantly reduce government expenditure, and it's at the same level of 2017-2018. Mr. Vice President, as I summarize, budget themes have not in the past translated into reality and have worsened our economic position. Budget deficits persist. The largest deficits are now being realized. Net public sector debt continues to climb. External borrowing will be expensive due to falling interest rates and will put pressure on foreign reserves. Domestic borrowing can create a systematic financial risk if unmanaged. Our reserves need to be managed in terms of our value, and probably now may be the time to signal the second band within which the dollar could be traded, given that we had a 6.82 upper limit in the band presented by the minister, and we are fast approaching there. I also gave a recommendation with respect to Forex to ask whether or not purchasers and sellers of foreign exchange could be facilitated through commercial banks on their own terms. I strongly objected to Tobago borrowing on its own, given its financial position, its dependence on Trinidad, and their lack of financial statements. I did ask that from the funding from CLF, as it's materialized, or as it's realized, I should say, can it be redirected to some of the debt incurred in the last year? In the context of diversification, I've presented areas of market development and product development which would bring direct and immediate improvements in the GDP of Trinidad and Tobago, while we await the performance of the yachting, creative, and IFCs. Those are long-term initiatives. I've presented you with short-term and medium-term initiatives. With respect to our global competitiveness rank, I commended the government, but something needs to be done with our macroeconomic environment to return investor confidence. And with respect to financial measures, there have been several ways to increase revenue, but no significant way to reduce government expenditure. Madam President, as I conclude, and as the budget document is presented, we've asked Trinidad and Tobago to balance the burden of adjustment, to share the burden of adjustment into the future. These are my questions I would really like answered. What is the rate of growth or contraction or stabilization, if there is, for the outlook for the Trinidad and Tobago economy based on Budget Statement 2018? Where are we going? Are we going forward in terms of improvement? Are we going backward in terms of contraction? Or are we stabilizing? What's the output? How are we going to measure the performance of this fiscal package? Given we did not have a balanced budget as proposed in the Budget Statement of 2016 by the Minister of Finance, when can we look towards a balanced budget? And by balance, I mean core revenue equals expenditure, not core revenue plus financing. When can we look towards that? What is the minimum level of foreign exchange buffers or reserves that we are going to maintain to both defend the currency and offer as a buffer with respect to debt? What are we going to allow it to fall to that we deem tolerable? What is the target rate of unemployment in our country given the fiscal package 2017-2018? Given the debt management strategy, absence of the debt management strategy, which the Honorable Minister of Finance promised in an earlier speech or presentation that we never got, what is the new accepted level of debt to GDP in this country, given that we are at the 65% that was promised? Is there a suggested band that the dollar would now trade as, given that we've approached the upper limit of 682? How is a falling credit rating of our country going to be addressed? And which are the areas of government expenditure you intend to reduce as core revenue falls? Given these variables were largely omitted in this budget statement, I'm asking through the minister, in your budget, in your response, would you kindly address these benchmarks? Because as we ask the population to carry the burden, we need to give the population a direction and some element of hope. Right now, we don't know, or I don't know, where we are going, given the performance of these macroeconomic indicators. Madam President, I thank you.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President, for allowing me to join this debate on an act to provide for the service of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ending 30th September 2018. Madam President, before I go into my contribution, let me welcome our three opposition senators, Senator Haynes, Senator Hussain, and Senator Obika, and also place on the record our gratitude to the outgoing or the opposition senators, Senator Sturge, Senator Solomon, and Senator Samuel, for their service to the country. As you know, Madam President, Senator Sturge was a favorite of mine, and I would really miss him. Madam President, at the start of the sit-in, I set aside 4 sheets of paper to make notes, 2 for Senator Mark and 2 for Senator Shrikissoon. I thank Senator Mark for saving me the problem of using his 2, so that I could dedicate all 4 to Senator Shrikissoon. I found, Madam President, and I commend him, I found Senator Shrikissoon's presentation to be very crisp, understandable, and I agree with most of what he's said to us. And all I would offer now is some commentary on what he's put forward. Madam President, Senator Shrikissoon has always made the point of deficit budgeting, and the 9th consecutive year of it. And of course, it's no secret how we got to that position. And I found, Madam President, that the exercise led by the Prime Minister on Spotlight, which preceded the budget, to be very informative for me as a minister and as a legislator, and for the citizens of the country who took the opportunity to follow it. Because it painted the picture, Madam President. And something that really, even though I had heard it so much, something that as a citizen of the country and still relatively young citizen of the country, something that really struck me was the fact that even as energy prices were at such an unprecedented level, both in terms of oil and natural gas, and even as our revenue situation still looks so healthy, that the only time we were making contributions to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund was when we were borrowing to do that. And that is something that even, Madam President, that is something that really strikes me as being unacceptable in terms of management of the economy. It is not just the deficit budgeting, but also in the way in which we failed to set aside into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund what we were earning as additional revenue based on the bonanza in both oil and gas. And then when we look at the profile of the expenditure, Madam President, in no household, nobody wants to be spending more than you're earning. It's something so fundamental that for those of us who have children, it's something that we inculcate in them. All of us grew up hearing that you must hang your hat where your hand could reach. And that also struck me out of spotlight as a minister, as a legislator, and as a citizen, that even as revenues increase, the expenditure profile was much higher. And what did we spend on? And I listened to Senator Mark, and it's a point I always make in the Senate. We have to understand how we got to this position. And the things that struck me out of spotlight was the expansion of the state enterprise debt over a period of time. And the most important thing in relation to any state entity was the raid on the National Gas Company. We cannot overemphasize that. The way in which NGC was raided. But Madam President, if NGC, in response to Senator Shrikissoon, if NGC was raided, or if any part of the 16 billion was taken to make an investment in the future of natural gas in this country, given the important role of NGC, then I may not have had a problem with it. But Madam President, as I went around this country, even in my own community, about 500 feet from where I grew up, there's a ground called the Shell Recreation Ground. And I was surprised to see a sign at Shell Recreation Ground saying that the refurbishment of that ground, which never took place, by the way, was a project of the National Gas Company. And in my community, as I went around to various recreation grounds, I was surprised. I could not see the link between the National Gas Company and these recreation grounds, all of which were earmarked for repair, but were never actually repaired. And Madam President, even as a citizen of this country, when I go down to the Couva interchange, as minister, I have to go down to Couva very often.
$29 million.
I cannot explain this. I don't know how to describe it, Madam President. The circles constructed there. And sometimes I wish, Madam President, I could take one circle and take it to Rio Claro and give it to the community and say, make use of it. And I could take another circle and carry it up to Matlat and tell the community, use it as a homework center. But they're there. And even after $29 million, it's not complete. And the only completion that will take place is that it is a complete disaster. And Madam President, that to me tells us how we get here. But Madam President, when we came in September 2015, I also, because this is my first time on this part of the politics, first time as a minister and first time as a legislator. And I, Madam President, I could not believe that a government or anybody in public life, anybody, could contract debt or commit to a project in this country without a confirmation of funding in the form of a loan or in the form of some sort of financial arrangement. And when this government came in and saw the Point 14 hospital project, for example, a government-to-government arrangement with the government of Austria, with the documents in disarray, the documents to support the loan arrangement. When the government came in and saw the Arima Hospital, estimated to cost over $1 billion, without a source of funding earmarked for the project. And as those early months went on, every week and in some ministries every day, in the Ministry of Works, in the Minister of Works, previous Minister of Works talked about it, and this one I'm sure knows. Commitments, some oral in the case of the Ministry of Works, oral commitments to contractors, asking contractors or directing contractors to do work, and committing to billion, not million-dollar projects, but billion-dollar projects, without either loan arrangements or other funding arrangements set in place. Senator Shrikissoon, that is what brought us here. That is what brought us here, and it is not an issue with the politicians alone. I've always said that. I've consistently said it. It's not only the politicians. It's public servants and public officials who sit and are paid by taxpayers to ensure that these things do not happen, who engage in this business that brings us to the point that we are. And when you look at the expenditure, when you look at it, and I fully support you on your analysis on where investments should go, and you correctly identified agriculture, and I'll talk about agriculture. You correctly identified agriculture. And you know, Senator Shrikissoon, sometimes I wish that the 29 million for the wrong thing in the interchange, that I had the 29 million. Because I could tell you when I come to agriculture what I will do with that. And I will just finish that point by saying this. You know, Madam President, I ain't getting into the rara, but I heard some discussion from these sacrosanct people about a $3 million allocation for a golf course. And the noise and the thing and the country people. And I wondered if this country knows that the last administration, in their closing months, just as they did with EMBD, the closing months, approved a $35 million allocation for the Sevilla golf course in Cuba. $3 million for Chagaramas compared to $35 million in Cuba. And the Mayaro Library that is incomplete, that a contract was awarded in 2011, 2012 to do that library for $12 million. And a payment was made to settle a claim for works done, a payment in the sum of $19 million. And the completion of the library projected to cost a further $12 million. That is why we're here. That is why we're here. And it is the politicians, the public servants, and the leadership, and the auditors, and everybody in the state agency. Everybody must share this burden of adjustment. Everybody. Because that is the behavior that brought us to this position. And I understand Senator Shrikissoon's anxiety for us to create the perfect economic stage, the declining socio-economic, the declining macroeconomic rating ought not to be surprising. Because if your expenditure, this bill, Madam President, proposes to allocate to the Ministry of Agriculture $771,704,362. And Madam President, I'm in the schedule on this section 2 of the schedule, the second column. That is the allocation to the Ministry of Agriculture. But when you look at the profile of that allocation, it is not very different from the national profile of expenditure. Because you know, Senator Shrikissoon, that $50 billion, when you look at how much is going into technology that would make us more efficient, more effective as decision makers. So I, as a minister, when I have every land file in the Ministry of Agriculture, has to come to the minister and go to the cabinet. And when I'm dealing with the backlog of leases in this country, when I get a file with a lease that expired in 1947, I am almost like a curator, turning the pages, they're so brittle. And every file is a file, a real file, not an electronic file like in your business, you know, a physical file. And I take home a box every evening with 5 of them, a box. So if the $50 billion included the sort of investment so that all of those files could become electronic files, and not only me, but members of the public would be able to access their files, it would be a more effective investment. But we are spending money on salaries and wages. The bulk of the $50 million is to pay public servants and contract workers. And the other big part of it is in debt financing. And I sat as a minister in the front row at Spotlight. And it was the public servants, P.S. Dan Paul, who made the presentation showing that we were spending, and the reason why our expenditure profile is not only expanded, but uncontrollable, is because we have incurred debt that must be paid, and we have hired workers who must be kept on the payroll unless we make a fundamental change in how we deal with our staff as taxpayers. We must make a shift. And that is why, even though the government was able to pull the expenditure down, we could not match expenditure this year with revenue, simply because we accept that one is at depressed levels and one is at a point where you will only reduce it if you send people home. The government is on record as saying that we are not prepared to do that at this time. We're not prepared to do that. And that is why the fundamentals in our economy would remain at that state where we're trying to survive. The Prime Minister has said it is not a secret. And I find it difficult to understand why people can't understand what we're saying. That not only are we facing problems in paying our debts, we are borrowing to pay wages and salaries. And not one of you, not one of us here, running a business and coming to work every morning and not seeing the employees. And the employees walking in where they want, leaving when they want. Not one of us will run a business where we go to the bank and borrow money to pay them. Not one of us. And it hurts me every single day. Every single day. I have to observe taxpayers of this country borrowing to pay people who do not produce. Who do not produce. And Senator Mark will tell you, we sit in a committee dealing with public administration, and he will tell you that I have always asked for us to bring into the glare the public service of this country. Public service of this country. So that we'll understand that this is what we're paying for out of the 50 billion. Performers and non-performers and people who, as managers, we can't do nothing with. Can't do nothing with them, and they know that. And Madam President, this $771 million, let me just add to what was said in the budget presentation and repeated by my colleague, Senator West, today. The allocation in the budget contribution of the Honorable Minister of Finance, he referred to $0.544 billion being allocated to the Ministry of Agriculture. And if that was the allocation, I would have been upset with him. The allocation referred to is the recurrent expenditure that comes out of the consolidated fund. And that allocation of $544 million, I wish it was billion, covers personnel, $387 million. 70% of the recurrent expenditure is on salaries and wages. Goods and services, $110 million. Minor equipment, $122,000. And statutory bodies, $49 million. As a recurrent that comes out of consolidated. There is a further $178 million, which is described as transfers and subsidies. That brings us to $725 million. And in the development program this year, out of the consolidated fund, $45.8 million is allocated for the development program. And that, Madam President, is how we come to this figure in the bill of $771,704,362. To that, you must add $24 million that comes out of the Infrastructure Development Fund, and you get to $795 million. But, Madam President, there are other allocations in support of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. One is in the reforestation program that employs 2,225 workers through 60 contractors across the country. There's a $98 million expenditure made in the last fiscal that comes out of the unemployment fund. In ADB, through the Ministry of Finance, there's an allocation this year of $50 million. We have a company that was closed in the last fiscal and we still have obligations. There's an allocation in the Ministry of Finance of $2.6 million for that. Currently 1975 Limited, where the ministry has significant land matters still to deal with, there's an allocation under the Ministry of Finance of $14.4 million for that. The Ministry of Rural Development is, through the Rural Development Company, is developing a port in Moruga, for which the Ministry of Agriculture is the ultimate beneficiary. There's a $6 million allocation. The Moruga Agro-Industrial Estate is being developed through the Ministry of Trade. There is a $69 million allocation for that project. CPEP, and the government is on record as saying the CPEP allocation is to be divided between the Ministries of Works and Transport, Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. The allocation to the ministry under CPEP is $116 million. There's a company that is a residue of the sugar industry, Sugar Manufacturing Company Limited, which still does work for the ministry. There's an allocation of $3.2 million. When you add that, the $771 million that is the subject of this bill, and the allocations made elsewhere in support of this ministry, you get to $1.174 billion for the ministry's work this year. Let me just go back, Madam President.
Minister. At this stage, honorable members, we will suspend and we will come back at 1.